Next, of course, we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman and her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. A short story, by the way, which had an interesting sort of publication history. There were a number of people who didn't want to see this thing published, and you can go into all of the history behind it and such. But suffice it to say that for many, many decades, until really about the 20th century, in the 1970s and 80s, I remember that some of the early articles that were written on it sort of viewed it as a relatively unknown, undiscovered piece. Since then, since the 80s especially, it's been very much written about. And Gilman herself has been the subject of quite a bit of scholarly attention. Most of what I had to say about the short story I've put into the notes, but I do want to touch on a few things here. I can't underscore enough how important it is for you to understand that mental health used to be a subject that was really discussed only in private. In fact, a lot of health-related issues, particularly things that were terminal illnesses or things of this nature, just weren't talked about. And to us, it seems rather odd that people wouldn't talk about certain things. But then again, our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren might find some of the things that we don't want to talk about rather curious as well and very odd. But there was a time, for example, just in the 20th century, where people never even talked about cancer because it was such a death sentence for so many people. You didn't want to bring it up; it would disturb people. It's just something you didn't want to talk about. It was too sad. Mental health sometimes was that sort of way as well. Mental retardation, mental health, children with birth defects just weren't talked about and weren't viewed in public and weren't brought out in public. We institutionalized people to a very large extent. We hid them in many ways. We hid them away. And you can go into all kinds of reasons why you think that might have been, but this is a really radical departure from that, because not only is it depicting someone who's having mental and emotional problems, but it's also arguing for that person's relative helplessness. Helpless not because she isn't a strong and creative person. She's actually a very educated, Jane's a very educated person. Jane's a very aware person in many respects. Jane is our narrator is a person that's nobody's fool in many ways, and yet allows herself to be manipulated, dominated by especially male figures, be it her doctor or her husband. And of course, that's what Charlotte Perkins Gilman is trying to show us: is that even the most educated, creative, talented woman of the era, someone of an upper class even, has limitations placed upon her based on her gender, and is treated very much like a child. I mean, look at the language her husband uses. She's treated as a child. This is really one of the very earliest public statements, treatments that I'm aware of anyway, in American literature, dealing with a character who is suffering from what we now know as postpartum depression. It's a confusing enough and challenging enough, difficult condition that many women go through today, even with our knowing what it is. Imagine what it was like 100 and some odd years ago when people didn't even know what it was. The fellow down at the bottom part of your screen, Weir Mitchell, is in a way sort of the villain of all of this. He's the one who invented the rest cure. So here's a woman who is suffering from deep depression. It's hormonally and biologically caused, we think. I'm not a medical doctor, but I mean, this guy basically says, oh, isolate yourself from other human beings and bore yourself to death. Oh, that's a great treatment for depression. Cut yourself off from all human contact and be bored all day. Talk about something that adds gasoline to a fire. I mean, it couldn't be worse, I think. By the way, curious little footnote here: if you know anything about this television show Grimm, there is an actor there named Silas Weir Mitchell. That's his name. He's a character in that show, and he's an actor. I guess he's about in his 40s now. I don't know. He's a direct descendant of this Silas Weir Mitchell. Grew up in Philadelphia, all that kind of stuff. He proudly bears his ancestors' name. If he knew that much about what a quack Dr. Weir Mitchell was, maybe he wouldn't be so proud. I don't know. But look it up, Google it. It's kind of an interesting side note. One of the things that's important about the short story that you need to bear in mind here is how important Victorian middle class women viewed their domestic roles. Notice how she has been a mother, a woman would have been seen as being, her sphere of influence, as they would have said in the 19th century, was the home. She was the heart and the soul of the home. She's what held the home together. She's what held the family together. And in almost this sort of angelic, ethereal, spiritual way, she was the spiritual glue that held the family together. What happens when a woman can't do that anymore? Because she's not able to do that and be that person and be there for everyone. What happens? Well, in this story, we see that John's sister and even the housemates start filling in those roles that really are supposed to be the role, in the 19th century anyway, of the mom, of the wife. She's supposed to be the one in charge of household things, and now she's abdicated that by force because of this doctor who's told her not to do any of those kinds of things, not to socialize, not to do anything except sleep all day. Well, that's good for depression, isn't it? And so she's been displaced. She's been thrown out of her orbit in a way. Now, you and I realize that there's more to women than just their domestic roles. But in the 19th century, this was extremely important. It was an important part of the concept of who a woman was to herself and to other people. And sacrificing that, losing that, having that slip away from you was sort of like having your very identity slip away from you. I can't make too much of it. I only have a moment here just to mention that, but this is the subject of quite a bit of scholarship and historical and sociological scholarship, the role of women in the 19th century. Vast libraries have been written on it, but it is a very important thing to bear in mind as we're reading through here. This is a woman who was, brought up to see herself as fulfilling a certain duty, a certain role in life, and now she's not going to be able to do that. And what does that do to her? Well, it, precipitates essentially madness. Another thing to kind of keep in mind here, it's kind of fun to think about, is the fact that we're dealing, of course, with an unreliable narrator. The end of the story can be a little bit confusing if you haven't caught on to the fact that the lady is slowly losing grip, right, throughout the story. Early on, you just believe the narrator is, relating everything as it is. But it is an interesting question when you're dealing with realist fiction. What do we do with realism when the narrator that's giving us this portrait of events can't be accurate or isn't as accurate as she or he could be? What do you do with unreliable narrators? Well, you depict unreliable narrators as they are. That's the answer, I think. But did you notice that she couldn't have stopped writing? That's what John and the doctor said, stop writing, stop writing. And she hides her notes and things like that. Even down to this question, how could she have stopped writing and obeyed the male authority figures in her life if we have this account? The account had to come from somewhere. It's first person. It must be her notes. It must be her journal or her diary that we're being offered up to read here. So evidently, she didn't do what she was told to do. She's a highly creative person who's trapped. Gilman herself faced a very sad ending to her life. She became terminally ill and took her own life, as most people believe, and did not have a terribly, she, like Chopin, did not have a terribly happy life for a lot of different reasons, but exhibited enormous talent as a writer. And her corpus of material, her body of works, isn't very large, but what she did write was some of the best stuff of the era.